The city had once been a bustling metropolis, full of life and the hum of everyday activity. Now, it was a ghost town, at least on the surface. Buildings stood tall against a gray sky, their glass windows shattered, their walls scarred with signs of chaos. Streets that once thrived with cars and people now lay eerily quiet. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but there was an unsettling stillness that made it even worse. The few who remained had no choice but to keep moving, always alert, always aware that the dead, those once familiar faces, would rise again at any moment. The survivors had become experts at surviving, their senses sharper than ever before, constantly fighting off fear. They had learned to move in silence, knowing the slightest sound could attract the deadly horde that still roamed the streets. Among them were 5 survivors, a former soldier, a street-smart mechanic, a doctor, an engineer, and a teenager. Each of them had their own stories, their own reasons for still being alive. But in this new world, those reasons didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was survival. "We need to move fast," said Marcus, the former soldier. His voice was low, authoritative. He had been the one to take charge after the initial chaos, the one who kept everyone together. They had been running from one place to another for days, scavenging for food, water, and supplies, always one step ahead of the undead. But even he knew that sooner or later, their luck would run out. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," Sarah, the doctor, spoke up, her voice shaky with exhaustion. "The city is changing. Every time we think we've lost them, they come back stronger." The others didn't need to hear the words. They had all felt it. The undead had adapted. They didn't just stagger aimlessly anymore. They hunted in packs, moved with purpose, and, worst of all, they didn't stay down. Bodies that had been put down would rise again hours later, even more dangerous and unpredictable than before. It was as if the city itself had become a tomb, trapping them with no way out. "You're right," Marcus acknowledged. "The city's not safe anymore. We need to head north, to the old train station. If we can get there, there might still be a chance to escape." His eyes swept over the group. "We'll have to fight our way out." Jess, the mechanic, adjusted her makeshift weapon, a large wrench. Her hands were stained with grease, but her eyes were sharp. "I don't like the sound of that. If we're going to fight, we need to know what we're up against. I've been hearing noises around the outskirts of the city. It's like they're gathering, almost as if they're waiting for us." The others fell silent. The thought of a coordinated attack sent a chill through everyone. Could the zombies really be planning something? It was a terrifying thought, but they couldn't afford to ignore it. They had to move, and fast. With a nod from Marcus, the group began to gather their things. They had their weapons, their supplies, and each other. But deep down, they all knew that no matter how well they prepared, there was no guarantee they would make it out. As the group moved through the city's narrow streets, the sounds of distant moaning reached their ears. The dead were out there, always just a step behind them, but their presence didn't make it any easier. The city had become a maze of streets, alleys, and dark corners where danger lurked at every turn. The survivors walked cautiously, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. They couldn't afford to make any noise. A misplaced step could alert the undead to their presence, and there was no telling how long they could survive if they were cornered. As they reached an intersection, the ground beneath their feet suddenly trembled. A distant roar echoed through the streets, followed by the unmistakable sound of countless feet shuffling toward them. The undead were near. "Get ready!" Marcus shouted, his voice commanding. They didn't need any more encouragement. Everyone took up their positions, preparing for what was to come. Jess and Sarah climbed onto the roof of an abandoned building, using the high ground for better visibility. The others took up positions in the alley, waiting for the first sign of movement. And then, they saw it. A wave of zombies, emerging from the shadows, moving with unholy speed. They didn't just walk, they charged, propelled by something beyond the natural. As the survivors watched in horror, they realized one terrifying truth: the dead were no longer the mindless, slow creatures they had once been. They were faster, more organized, and more dangerous than ever. "Hold your ground," Marcus yelled. "Don't let them surround us." The fight for survival had just begun. The last stand in a city where the dead refused to stay down was upon them. The air was thick with tension as the survivors braced themselves. The undead approached with chilling speed, their ragged movements becoming more coordinated by the second. It was like they had learned from every encounter, adapted to every attack. Their eyes were glazed with hunger, but there was something else, something darker. Marcus, his heart pounding in his chest, gripped his weapon, a combat knife he had scavenged weeks ago. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The city was a death trap, and right now, this narrow alley was their last chance at survival. They couldn't afford to mess up. Up on the rooftop, Jess peered through her makeshift binoculars, scanning the approaching horde. Her breath hitched in her throat. They're moving too fast," she muttered under her breath. The words were barely audible, but they sent a ripple of fear through the group below. "They're evolving," Sarah said, a cold shiver running down her spine. "They're not like the ones we've fought before." Marcus nodded grimly. He had suspected as much. The undead had changed. The days of the slow, lumbering walkers were long gone. Whatever had caused this outbreak seemed to have accelerated the process, giving the infected more cunning, more aggression. "We need to make it to the train station before it gets worse," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos that churned inside him. "If we don't, we'll be trapped here, just like everyone else." The horde was closing in fast, and there was no time to waste. They had to fight or flee. Down below, the rest of the group readied themselves. Liam, the teenage survivor, held his shotgun tightly, his knuckles white with the pressure. He wasn't used to this. He had been a normal kid, once. But now? He was a fighter, a survivor. And he wasn't about to let his group go down without a fight. "I'll cover the back," Liam volunteered, his voice tense. Marcus looked at him, his gaze intense. "Be careful. We can't afford any mistakes." Liam nodded, his eyes steely. "I won't let them get close." The others spread out, positioning themselves strategically along the alley. Jess had a makeshift bow, her arrows tied together with bits of cloth for added strength. Sarah, the doctor, held a small but sturdy pipe, her knowledge of human anatomy giving her an edge in combat. She might not be a fighter, but she could strike where it counted. They didn't need to speak, each of them knew their role. As the horde moved closer, they remained as quiet as possible, barely breathing, knowing that one sound, a cough, a misstep, could give them away. Every minute felt like an eternity. The first wave of zombies appeared around the corner, their grotesque faces twisted with hunger. The survivors froze. The creatures shuffled into view, unaware of the group's presence, until one of them, a young woman with her arm missing, turned its head with eerie precision. Its vacant eyes locked onto the group. "Move!" Marcus shouted, breaking the silence. Liam fired his shotgun first, the loud blast ringing through the narrow alley. The blast echoed, but it did the job. 2 zombies were thrown back, their skulls shattered. But the rest of the horde didn't hesitate. They came at them, faster than they'd expected. Jess, from the rooftop, launched an arrow that pierced the skull of an approaching zombie, its body collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. But there were more. So many more. Sarah swung the pipe with precision, striking the closest zombie in the head. It collapsed instantly, its body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. But they kept coming. No matter how many they took down, 2 more appeared to take their place. "Don't let them get too close," Marcus warned, his voice rising above the chaos. The survivors moved like a well-oiled machine, each one focused on their task. Marcus was the leader, the one guiding them through the storm, but each member of the group brought their own strength. They were a team, and in that moment, the bond they shared was the only thing keeping them alive. But it wasn't enough. The zombies were relentless, like a flood of bodies, pushing against the survivors' defenses. They could hear the shrieks of the undead, the sound of their feet shuffling faster and faster, the air thick with the smell of death. "They're coming from all sides," Liam shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Just as the group started to retreat, trying to regroup and get to safer ground, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The sound of something massive approaching reached their ears, like a horde of zombies was gathering even closer than before. Jess's voice crackled through the radio, her tone sharp. "They're coming from the rooftops. They're swarming the entire city." Marcus's heart dropped. The city was closing in on them. The safe route they had once counted on had vanished. The undead were smarter now, they were everywhere. "What do we do?" Liam asked, his voice desperate. "We fight," Marcus said, his resolve firm. "And we don't stop fighting until we get out of here." The city that had once been a place of opportunity was now their cage. And the dead were the ones holding the keys. The fight was far from over. The air was thick with the sounds of desperate struggle. The survivors fought with everything they had, but every time they struck down a zombie, two more took its place. The group had no choice but to keep pushing forward, retreating when necessary, but always moving toward the north, their only chance for escape. Marcus, the former soldier, led the charge, his combat knife slicing through the necks of the advancing zombies with brutal precision. His every movement was calculated, each strike designed to take down the dead before they could overwhelm them. But as the horde continued to press in from every direction, it became clear that their fight for survival was more than just a physical battle. It was a race against time. "We need to find cover." Sarah, the doctor, shouted over the chaos, her voice strained but urgent. "We can't keep fighting like this. We'll run out of energy." She was right. They were running low on ammunition, and their stamina was quickly fading. The adrenaline that had fueled them at the start of the fight was beginning to wear off, replaced by exhaustion. Marcus glanced around, his eyes scanning the alleyway for an escape route. "Head for the building," Marcus shouted. "Up the stairs, now." The group began to move as one, sprinting toward the nearest building, an old apartment complex that loomed dark and foreboding in the distance. The undead were close, too close. Marcus knew they couldn't afford to stop, not even for a second. Liam ran ahead, his shotgun raised, ready to fire at anything that got too close. Jess and Sarah followed closely behind, the mechanic's bow raised and ready, her arrows at the ready. The doctor's makeshift pipe swung with deadly force, striking down any zombie that came too close. They reached the building, and without hesitation, Marcus kicked open the door. The old wood splintered under the force of his boot, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The survivors piled inside, slamming the door behind them with as much force as they could muster. "We can't stay here long," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "We need to get to the roof. The higher we are, the better our chances." The others nodded in agreement. They knew the city had become a labyrinth of danger, but they had no choice but to climb higher, hoping the elevation would give them a better view of the surrounding area and the approaching horde. The sound of the undead crashing against the building's walls echoed from the alley below. Their groans filled the air like a sickening symphony, a constant reminder of the horrors that awaited just outside. Jess took the lead, her instincts as a mechanic kicking in as she worked to pry open the door to the building stairwell. The hinges creaked and groaned, but the door finally gave way. She waved the others forward, and they moved quickly up the stairs, each step bringing them closer to the roof, and, hopefully, safety. But even as they ascended, the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet grew louder, followed by the low moans of the undead. The zombies had already begun to gather outside the building. They were learning. Adapting. And they wouldn't give up until they had their prey. "What do we do if we get trapped on the roof?" Liam asked, his breath quickening with anxiety. Marcus didn't hesitate. "We fight. We don't give them the chance to corner us." They reached the roof, gasping for breath, but the sight that greeted them was anything but comforting. The city stretched out in all directions, a maze of broken streets and abandoned buildings. But what was most terrifying was the sea of undead that covered the streets below. It wasn't just a horde, it was an army, moving like a tidal wave through the city, sweeping everything in its path. "We're not safe here either," Jess said, scanning the horizon. "There's nowhere left to go." Marcus knew she was right. They had reached the top, but it felt like they had only run out of places to hide. The city was surrounded by the undead, and every escape route was closed off. They were trapped, with nowhere left to run. But there was something else on the horizon, a distant rumble. It wasn't the sound of thunder. It was the sound of something mechanical. Something human. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with hope. "That's not the dead." Marcus listened intently. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. The sound of an engine. A vehicle. "Someone's out there," Marcus said, a surge of hope rising in his chest. "If we can signal them, we might have a chance." Liam's eyes lit up. "Do you think they'll see us?" "We could use the flare gun." Marcus shook his head. "We don't know who they are. We can't risk giving away our position to more zombies than we can handle. We need to be strategic." The rumbling grew louder, and soon, they could make out the shape of a convoy of military vehicles, their headlights flashing as they approached the city's outskirts. "We have to get to them," Marcus said. "We'll need to fight our way through the undead to reach them, but it's our only chance." The survivors exchanged determined glances. They had come this far. They weren't about to give up now. But as they turned to leave the roof, something caught their attention: the zombies. They were no longer scattered. They were closing in. And they were moving with purpose. It wasn't just the city that had adapted. The undead were hunting them. The fight was far from over, and now, they were the prey. The convoy was still in sight, but it was moving steadily further away. The survivors had no time to waste. The sound of the military vehicles, once a beacon of hope, was now a reminder of how much ground they needed to cover, and how quickly the undead were closing in. Marcus took a deep breath, pushing the fear that clawed at the back of his mind aside. This was it. This was their chance. They had to get to those vehicles, and they had to do it now. "Stay close," Marcus said, his voice steady but urgent. "We move fast and quiet. We can't afford to draw attention." Liam, his face pale from exhaustion, nodded, gripping his shotgun tightly. "Right behind you." The group quickly descended from the roof, their movements swift and precise. As they hit the ground level, the sounds of the undead grew louder, closer. The narrow streets were filled with the echoes of shuffling feet and guttural moans. There was no time to waste. Jess, ever the strategist, led the way, scanning the area ahead. She had to think quickly, had to come up with a plan to keep them from being overwhelmed. The alleyways were too tight, the zombies too numerous. They needed open space, fast. "Through the parking lot," Jess suggested, pointing toward a large, open area just ahead. "We'll have more room to maneuver." Marcus nodded, but his eyes flickered to the increasing mass of undead around them. They couldn't afford to hesitate. "Go!" They sprinted, the sound of their boots slapping against the cracked pavement drowned out by the clamor of the undead nearby. Every step felt like it could be their last. The infected were everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before they realized the survivors weren't just part of the scenery, they were prey. As they neared the parking lot, Marcus felt a sudden surge of panic. Something was wrong. The air had shifted, the atmosphere charged with an eerie tension. It wasn't just the usual dread of being chased. It was something else, something deeper. Something had changed. "Watch out!" Sarah screamed, her voice full of fear. Marcus whipped around, his instincts kicking in just as a group of zombies surged from an alleyway to their left. They were fast, too fast. These weren't the stumbling, brain-dead monsters they had gotten used to. These were organized, their movements coordinated. And they weren't just approaching, they were hunting. "Run!" Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The survivors scattered, their breath ragged, hearts pounding in their chests. Jess pulled back an arrow from her bow, launching it with expert precision into the head of an approaching zombie. It dropped like a stone, but the others kept coming, undeterred. The sound of gunfire echoed as Liam fired his shotgun, taking down 2 zombies in a single blast. But it wasn't enough. For every zombie they took down, it seemed like there were 10 more. "We can't keep this up," Liam yelled, his voice tinged with panic. "Just keep moving." Marcus barked back, his face grim. "We need to reach that convoy, now." They fought their way through the parking lot, dodging zombies that were more relentless than ever. The infected were closing in from all sides, a wall of rotting flesh and hungry eyes. Marcus could hear the growls and moans rising around him, drowning out everything else. He was losing track of time, losing track of everything except the burning need to survive. "We're almost there," Jess shouted as they neared the edge of the lot. The military vehicles were still visible in the distance, but the sea of zombies was growing thicker. They were being pushed closer and closer to the edge of the lot, forced to fight for every inch. There was no time to plan, no time to think. It was pure instinct now. A screech of tires sliced through the air, and Marcus glanced up to see the convoy, a line of military trucks and jeeps, slowing down, their headlights flashing. A loudspeaker blared through the night, its voice distorted but clear enough to hear, "Get to the convoy, now." The survivors had no choice but to fight their way toward it. "We're not going to make it," Sarah screamed, her voice tight with fear. "There's too many of them." But Marcus refused to give in. "We'll make it. We have to." Suddenly, a loud, shuddering noise shook the ground beneath their feet. Marcus looked up, his heart in his throat. The largest of the zombies, one that seemed almost too big to be real, lurched forward from the crowd, its grotesque figure towering over the others. It was a hulking beast, with rotting skin stretched taut over muscle and bone. It had a massive arm raised, ready to strike. "Watch out!" Jess yelled. The survivors scattered as the monster swiped at them, its hand crashing through the air like a wrecking ball. Marcus dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its reach. But it wasn't done. The creature roared, its howl reverberating through the night. "Focus on the big one," Marcus shouted, his voice filled with determination. Liam fired his shotgun at the massive zombie, but the creature barely flinched. It charged forward again, this time aiming for Sarah. Without thinking, Marcus sprinted forward, pulling Sarah out of the creature's path just in time. But the force of the monster's movement sent him sprawling to the ground. He rolled, the pavement scraping against his skin, and barely managed to regain his footing. "Get up!" Jess yelled, her voice urgent. The convoy's almost within reach. They couldn't let up. Not now. Marcus steadied himself, scanning the scene. The convoy was within reach, but they were still surrounded by an army of the undead. Time was running out. "Move," he shouted. "Now or never." With every last ounce of energy, the survivors pushed forward, making their final dash toward the convoy, toward their last hope for survival. But with each step they took, the horde closed in. The real question now wasn't if they would make it, but if they would survive long enough to get there. The convoy's headlights blazed ahead, cutting through the darkness of the city like beacons of hope. The military vehicles were now within reach, their tires screeching against the pavement as they slowed down to meet the survivors. But the horde was closing in, faster than ever. Every step they took toward safety felt like a gamble. Marcus was the first to break through the wave of zombies, his feet pounding against the concrete as he sprinted toward the military convoy. His body was a blur of motion, adrenaline coursing through him like fire. He could hear the screams of the others behind him, the sound of gunfire, and the sickening squelch of zombie bodies falling to the ground, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't look back. "Keep moving," Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the undead and the chaos around them. "We're almost there." Liam, Sarah, Jess, and the others fought desperately to keep the zombies at bay. Jess fired her bow with deadly accuracy, taking down several zombies in quick succession. Liam pumped his shotgun, his hands shaking, but his aim still true. Sarah wielded a metal pipe, swinging it with all her strength as she cleaved through the undead that got too close. They were so close to the convoy now, so close to safety. But as Marcus neared the line of military vehicles, he realized something terrifying: the undead weren't just following them. They were trying to surround them, to trap them in. The first of the military jeeps screeched to a halt in front of him, and the door swung open. A soldier, his face grim, leaned out. "Get in, now," the soldier yelled, waving frantically. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dove into the jeep, pulling himself up into the passenger seat, just as a massive zombie lunged at him. The soldier slammed the door shut, just as the undead beast's clawed hand scraped the side of the vehicle. "Go! Go! Go!" Marcus yelled. The jeep roared to life, and the convoy surged forward, tearing through the streets as the sound of screeching tires filled the air. The military vehicles plowed through the undead with ease, their powerful engines cutting through the zombies like a hot knife through butter. But the survivors weren't safe yet. The horde was relentless, and the convoy's progress was slow. The streets were clogged with the infected, their numbers growing with every passing minute. "Come on!" Jess shouted from the back of the jeep, her bow still in hand, ready to fire. "We can't keep going like this. We need to clear the way. Just keep moving," Marcus shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Don't stop." The jeep swerved to avoid a group of zombies, but just as it did, another massive zombie, larger than the first, emerged from the shadows, its grotesque body crashing through the nearby buildings. It let out a deafening roar, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. "That thing's going to kill us all," Liam shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "We have no choice," Marcus snapped. "Take it down." The jeep screeched to a halt as the massive zombie barreled toward them, its claws swiping the air like a wrecking ball. The soldier in the driver's seat slammed the door open, pulling out a heavy rifle and aiming at the creature. But before he could fire, the massive zombie lunged toward them with terrifying speed, its claws extended. The force of the impact threw the jeep sideways, sending it crashing into a nearby wall. The survivors were thrown from their seats, their bodies slamming into the ground as the vehicle flipped onto its side. The sound of metal scraping against concrete was deafening, but they had no time to recover. The undead were upon them. "Move!" Marcus shouted, scrambling to his feet. Liam, Jess, Sarah, and the others were up in an instant, their weapons ready, their survival instincts kicking in. The convoy was a mess now, half of the military vehicles disabled, and the horde was closing in on them. The survivors had only one option: fight their way out. Jess fired an arrow into the massive zombie's eye, but it barely slowed down. The creature howled in pain, but its rage only intensified. It swung its massive arm, knocking Jess off her feet. "Get back!" Marcus shouted, rushing to her side. He pulled Jess to her feet, his heart pounding as the undead surrounded them from all sides. "We have to push forward," he said, his voice strained. "There's no way we're getting out if we don't fight." They formed a tight circle, weapons raised, their backs pressed together. The sound of the undead closing in was deafening, their groans filling the air like an insistent, endless tide. But Marcus wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. The convoy had slowed, but it was still there, and with every passing moment, the sound of the military truck's engines grew louder. They were getting closer. But they needed a way through the zombies first. "Liam, on my count, we take that big one down," Marcus ordered, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Jess, Sarah, we cover each other. We're getting out of here. Together." The others nodded, their faces grim but determined. They had been through too much to let the undead take them now. 3, 2, 1. With a collective roar, they charged toward the massive zombie, their weapons raised and their bodies moving in perfect coordination. The massive creature lunged at them, but Marcus and Liam dodged its swing, firing their guns and aiming for the creature's weak spots. Jess fired a final arrow, this time striking the zombie in the throat. It let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing before it collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, the world seemed to go silent. The massive zombie was down. But the undead were still coming, more and more, from all sides. "We need to move, now," Marcus shouted. The convoy was almost there. The military vehicles plowed through the remaining zombies, and with one final push, the survivors rushed toward the trucks, leaping into the back just as the convoy broke free of the horde. As they drove away, the city slowly receding into the distance, the survivors were left with one terrifying thought: this was only the beginning. The convoy rumbled through the night, the sound of the military vehicles' engines drowning out the terrifying silence of the abandoned city they had left behind. The survivors sat in the back of the truck, their bodies bruised, bloodied, and exhausted, but their spirits were lifted by the promise of safety. At least for now. Marcus leaned against the side of the truck, his eyes scanning the horizon. The city was fading behind them, but the nightmare was far from over. He had seen enough of the world's collapse to know that even the military couldn't protect them forever. There would always be something worse on the horizon. "How long do you think it'll take before they track us down?" Liam asked, his voice rough from shouting earlier. "I don't know," Marcus replied, his eyes narrowing. "But we have to assume we're always being hunted. We can't rest, not for long. The world is different now." Sarah, who had been sitting silently next to him, spoke up. "We can't keep running. Eventually, we'll run out of places to go. Then we make a stand," Marcus said, his voice firm. "When the time comes, we fight. We don't just hide and hope we're not found." Jess shifted uncomfortably in the truck bed, glancing over her shoulder at the distant skyline of the city. The last few days had felt like a blur of chaos, with no time to think, no time to plan. Every decision felt like life or death. "We need to find somewhere safe," Jess said, her tone more contemplative than the others. "Somewhere the undead can't get to us." "Safe?" Sarah echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "There is no safe place anymore. We're running from the end of the world, and it's catching up." "We can still find somewhere," Jess said, looking out into the night. "If we stay ahead of the horde long enough, maybe we can find a base of operations. Somewhere secure enough to regroup, figure out our next move." A brief silence fell over them, the weight of Sarah's words hanging heavy in the air. For all the talk of survival, no one knew where to go. The world they had once known was gone. But Marcus had to believe there was still a chance. "We're not giving up," Marcus said, his voice hard as steel. "We're going to find a way. We'll keep pushing forward." The convoy sped along the desolate highway, the flickering streetlights casting eerie shadows as they drove deeper into the unknown. They passed a few scattered cars on the side of the road, abandoned by their owners, now nothing more than wreckage. The earth was scarred, the landscape marked by the devastation that had followed in the wake of the outbreak. As they drove, the leader of the convoy, a gruff, no-nonsense officer named Sergeant Rhodes, spoke up. His voice crackled over the truck's loudspeaker. "We're heading toward a military stronghold a few clicks north. It was a secure zone before the outbreak, but we'll need to assess the situation when we get there. I don't know what's left. We're not sure if it's still safe." "What do you mean, not sure?" Liam asked, his voice edged with frustration. "Is it safe, or isn't it?" "We're not sure because we haven't been able to get any comms from there in weeks," Sergeant Rhodes replied. "We'll know more when we get there, but don't get your hopes up too high. This world is unpredictable." There it was again, the unsettling truth that no one wanted to face. The idea that no place was truly safe, that no matter how hard they fought, the undead would keep coming, relentless and endless. The convoy continued its journey through the night, each bump in the road making the survivors' wounds ache. Marcus fought the overwhelming fatigue that gnawed at him, but his mind was still sharp. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Hours passed, and the city's skyline was nothing more than a fading memory on the horizon. The survivors were hungry, thirsty, and emotionally drained. Every one of them had seen things they couldn't forget, the faces of friends and family lost, the carnage that was once familiar but now seemed like another world entirely. "Look," Jess said, her voice low, pointing ahead. Ahead of them, the outline of a large structure loomed in the distance, an imposing military base. But something was wrong. The lights that had once illuminated the perimeter were out, and the towering walls, once a symbol of strength and security, now seemed hollow. Marcus' heart sank. "I've been to this base before," Sergeant Rhodes said, his voice tense. "It used to be a refuge for civilians. But the military had to pull out when the undead broke through our defenses. It's not what it used to be." As they drew closer, the eerie quiet of the area only deepened. The convoy slowed as they neared the base's gates, which were wide open. No soldiers were visible. "Something's not right," Marcus muttered, his hand instinctively gripping his weapon. "We need to move in slowly," Rhodes ordered. "Check the perimeter. If there are any survivors, they'll be holed up inside." The trucks came to a halt in front of the base, and the survivors cautiously climbed out, their weapons raised. They moved in formation, walking through the open gates of the military compound, their eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The silence was oppressive. No sounds of life, no movement. "We're not alone," Liam whispered, his voice tight with apprehension. Marcus could feel it too. The air was thick with the sense of something looming, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest. They were walking into a trap. Then, a sound. A low groan from the darkness. And then, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. The undead were here. Before they could react, a horde of zombies emerged from the shadows, pouring out of the base's interior like a flood. The survivors opened fire, but it was clear they were outnumbered. "Retreat!" Marcus shouted, pushing the others back toward the trucks. But the base had already become a killing ground. The gates slammed shut behind them as they tried to flee, trapping them inside with the undead. The real fight had just begun. The gates slammed shut behind them with an ear-splitting bang, trapping the survivors within the military compound. Panic surged through the group as the horde of zombies poured out of the shadows like an unstoppable wave, their growls and hissing filling the air. Marcus's heart raced as he turned to face the others. "We need to move, now," Marcus shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. The survivors didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted toward the nearest building, their weapons raised and ready for what was coming. The sound of the undead growing louder with every passing second sent a chill down their spines. Their every footstep felt like it could be their last. Liam fired his shotgun, the powerful blast echoing through the compound. One by one, zombies fell, but more took their place. Jess loosed arrow after arrow, her aim true as she downed several of the undead. But it wasn't enough. No matter how many they killed, the swarm kept coming, undeterred by their efforts. Marcus's mind raced as he scanned their surroundings. The military compound was vast, too vast to fight their way through without help. There had to be a way out, but the gates were locked, and the walls were high. The place felt like a fortress, but in reality, it was a trap. Head for the armory. Rhodes barked, breaking Marcus from his thoughts. If we can get inside, we'll have the weapons to make a stand. We need to hold them off long enough for the trucks to back us up. The survivors rushed toward the armory, their bodies moving on instinct, adrenaline fueling every step. But the closer they got, the more the zombies seemed to swarm, their gnashing teeth and clawing hands reaching for them, trying to drag them down. We're almost there. Marcus shouted, his voice growing hoarse as he pumped his rifle and shot down 2 zombies with quick precision. But just as they neared the armory doors, an explosion rang out nearby, throwing the group to the ground. The blast was deafening, the shockwave shaking the very air around them. The sound of gunfire intensified, and the groaning of the undead grew louder. What the hell was that? Liam yelled, his face contorted in confusion and fear. Stay down. Rhodes ordered, pulling them behind a stack of crates. We've got company, human company. Before anyone could respond, a group of armed soldiers appeared from around the corner, their rifles raised. They were wearing tattered military uniforms, their faces grim, but the sight of their weapons provided a brief moment of hope. We're not alone, Marcus muttered. But are they, friends or foes? The soldiers approached cautiously, their weapons still aimed at the survivors. The tension in the air was palpable. You're not military, one of the soldiers said, his voice cold and distrustful. Who are you people? We're survivors, Rhodes replied quickly, his voice firm. We need shelter, and we're not here to fight. We're just trying to get out of this alive. The soldier didn't lower his weapon. We don't have room for more. This place is as good as any to die in, and we've already lost enough people to the horde. Why should we trust you? We're armed, we know how to fight, and we're your best shot at surviving, Marcus said, stepping forward, his voice steady despite the overwhelming odds. We're not here to take your place, we just need help. The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly unsure. But time was running out. The horde was still closing in, the unmistakable sound of zombies shuffling and groaning echoing from all directions. We don't have time for this, Rhodes said, his patience wearing thin. We'll fight together, or we'll die together. Make your choice. The soldier who had spoken to Marcus looked at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant agreement. Finally, he nodded. Fine, he said gruffly. But you better pull your weight. Without another word, the soldiers lowered their weapons, and the group of survivors joined forces. The doors of the armory creaked open, and the survivors rushed inside, the cold air of the room offering a brief respite from the suffocating tension outside. Inside the armory, rows upon rows of weapons were stacked neatly on shelves, their metal surfaces gleaming under the dim light. It was an arsenal, a treasure trove of firepower. But the weight of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. Even with all the weapons in the world, it wouldn't be enough to guarantee survival. We need to fortify the doors, Marcus said, his voice low as he grabbed an assault rifle from the shelf. If we don't hold them off here, we won't make it anywhere. Right, Rhodes said, his eyes scanning the room. We'll set up barricades. Everyone get ready. The survivors and the soldiers moved quickly, setting up makeshift barricades with whatever they could find. Tables were overturned, metal shelves were moved into position, and ammunition was distributed among the group. Jess, Sarah, and Liam manned the windows, their weapons aimed at the incoming wave of zombies. Outside, the sound of the undead grew louder as they neared the armory. The survivors' hearts pounded in their chests as they prepared for the onslaught. They had no illusions of victory, this would be a fight to the death. But they weren't going down without a fight. The first wave hit hard. Zombies crashed against the barricades, their claws scraping against the walls as they tried to break through. The sound of groaning and screeching filled the air as the survivors opened fire, their weapons blazing as they took down zombie after zombie. The soldiers worked in unison, their training evident as they moved with precision, covering each other as they picked off targets. Jess's arrows flew with deadly accuracy, taking down several zombies in quick succession. Sarah's makeshift spear stabbed through the undead with brutal efficiency. But for every zombie that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The barricades shook with the force of the undead slamming against them. The survivors were fighting with everything they had, but it was clear, the horde was relentless. "We can't hold them off forever," Liam shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "We don't need to hold them forever," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing as he took aim at another approaching zombie. "We just need to hold them long enough for the trucks to get through." The battle raged on, the survivors and soldiers locked in a desperate struggle for survival. With every passing minute, the odds seemed to grow slimmer, but they fought on, fighting not just for their lives, but for the hope that somewhere, out there, there was still a way out of this nightmare. But as the horde pushed forward, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this might be their last stand. The barricades groaned under the relentless weight of the undead as they pressed against them. The survivors and soldiers alike were grimly aware that their makeshift defenses wouldn't last much longer. The sound of clawing hands and groaning bodies was deafening, and the smell of decay and desperation hung thick in the air. But they had no choice now. There was no retreat, no second chance. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he reloaded his rifle, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of the survivors, Jess, Liam, Sarah, and the soldiers, all battle-worn and exhausted, but determined. They were in this together, for better or worse. "We've held them off for as long as we can," Marcus said, his voice low and resolute. "But if we're going to make it out of here, we need to do something drastic." Sergeant Rhodes, who had been taking careful shots from a window, nodded. His face was grim, but his eyes showed a flicker of agreement. "There's a service tunnel underneath the armory," he said. "It leads to a bunker. If we can get to it, we might stand a chance. But it's not going to be easy." The ground shook as another wave of zombies slammed into the barricades, sending dust and debris falling from the ceiling. It was only a matter of time before the undead broke through. The room was beginning to feel smaller, the walls pressing in with every passing second. "Then it settled," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We make our way to that tunnel. We go in, together, and we don't look back." Liam, who had been firing out of a window, turned to look at Marcus, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "What if we can't get to it in time?" "We don't have a choice," Marcus replied. "We make it or we die trying." The survivors and soldiers quickly gathered their gear, making sure they had enough ammunition to make the journey to the tunnel. The barricades were already shaking violently, and the first cracks were beginning to form in their fragile defenses. It was clear they had no time to waste. Sarah, who had been the most reserved throughout the ordeal, spoke up. "What about the trucks? If we make a break for the tunnel, the trucks can't follow us." "We don't need the trucks anymore," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We've lost the convoy. It's just us now." The group quickly moved to the back of the armory, where Rhodes indicated a hatch in the floor. The rusted metal was barely visible through the dust, but it was there, a narrow escape route. It was their only shot. The sound of the zombies breaking through the barricades echoed through the room, a chilling reminder that time was running out. The survivors and soldiers worked quickly, throwing their weight against the hatch, which creaked open with a loud, protesting sound. One by one, they descended into the dark, narrow tunnel, their feet clanging against the metal stairs as they made their way into the bowels of the base. The tunnel was musty and cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. "We'll move quickly," Rhodes instructed. "Keep your weapons ready." We don't know what's waiting for us down there. The tunnel stretched out before them, a long, claustrophobic path that seemed to go on forever. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, a stark contrast to the chaos above. As they moved deeper into the passage, the walls began to narrow, the ceiling low enough that they had to crouch. "There's another hatch at the end of this tunnel," Rhodes said, his voice muffled in the darkness. "It should lead to an old bunker. We might be able to barricade ourselves in." Marcus nodded, his grip tight on his rifle as he led the way. The group moved in silence, every step heavy with the weight of uncertainty. It was impossible to know if the bunker would be safe, or if it was just another death trap. But it was their only option. The minutes stretched on as they crawled through the tunnel, the distant sounds of the undead above them growing louder. The barricade in the armory had been breached, and the horde was flooding into the compound. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel. A rusted hatch loomed ahead, half hidden in shadows. It seemed almost surreal, a fragile beacon of hope in the darkness. "Ready?" Marcus asked, turning to the group. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. The survivors nodded. They were tired, broken, and battered, but they had come too far to turn back now. Rhodes stepped forward and twisted the handle of the hatch, pushing it open with a creak. The cold air from the bunker hit them immediately, a welcome contrast to the stifling heat of the tunnel. "Move," Marcus said, his voice urgent. "We don't know how long this door will hold." They filed into the bunker, one by one, the hatch slamming shut behind them with a metallic clang. Inside, the room was dark and cold, the walls lined with shelves that once held supplies. The bunker had clearly been abandoned for a long time, but it was still standing. The door had been reinforced, and there was a faint, flickering light coming from a generator in the corner. The survivors took a moment to catch their breath, their bodies aching from the fight, but the relief was fleeting. "We're not safe yet," Marcus said, his voice low. "We've bought ourselves some time, but we need to find a way out of this. The horde won't stop. And eventually, the bunker will run out of supplies." "We'll figure something out," Rhodes said, though his tone was grim. "For now, we need to rest. We'll make a plan in the morning." But even as he spoke, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were just waiting for the next wave. They were alive, for now, but the world had changed, and the undead were always one step behind. The fight for survival was far from over. They had made it out of the city, but the true battle had just begun.